In regards to the dinim of making a vow, the Mishnah teaches that a child, even in the year before bar and bas mitzvah, could make a vow and their vow is valid. But we need to check, we need to examine, we need to check that they understand the significance of the vow, the consequences of the vow, that they understand for whom they are making the vow, they're making it for Hashem. The Mishnah goes on and says that we need to check with them that whole year, the whole year of the child or the girl being 11 years old or the boy being 12 years old, making sure that they actually understand the significance of the vow. The Gemara asks, why does the Mishnah need to say that we need to check the whole year? We said already that we need to make sure that they understand the significance of the vow. So the Gemara answers that we would have thought that if they made a vow in the beginning of the year, and we checked, and at that point, they didn't really understand the significance. They didn't really know who they're making the vow for and the consequences of the vow. Maybe there's no point checking again later in the year if they made another vow. So that's why the Mishnah says, no, if they made another vow, we'll check again. Now the Rambam brings this same halacha, but he brings it slightly differently. The Rambam says that during this year, if we examined and we checked earlier on in the year and they did know, they did have the proper knowledge of the vow, later on in the year they make another vow, we need to check once again, making sure that they still understand the significance of the vow. So the Mefarshim are surprised, the Mefarshim wonder. The Kesef Mishnah asks, the Gemara clearly says that we're speaking about if they didn't know earlier on. That's when we're going to check again. And that's understood because it's possible that earlier on they didn't have that maturity to understand, and later on in the year they do understand. Where is the Rambam getting this chiddush to say that even if they knew earlier on in the year, we still need to check again? So the Mefarshim, the Kesef Mishnah, as well as the Radvaz say that the truth is that the Rambam had such a girsa in the Gemara. The Kesef Mishnah says perhaps this was the way the Rambam's Gemara read. In other words, perhaps in the Rambam's Gemara, what it said was that if they did know earlier on in the year, that's when we check again. In fact, the Radva says, in a certain sense, this version of the Gemara makes more sense, is more understood. Because the way the Gemara says it, that if they didn't know earlier on in the year, that's when we're going to check again, this seems to be very strange. Because the Gemara there is trying to explain why the Mishnah needed to say that we're going to check throughout the year. That means, if the Mishnah would have not said that, we would have not understood that we need to check again. But seemingly, if the child didn't have the understanding in the earlier on in the year, why would we think not to check again later on in the year? I mean, it's a pretty natural thing. A child matures, and even if you didn't know earlier in the year, then later in the year, you're going to have more knowledge or more understanding. And therefore, the Radva says this is a more correct girsa, that even if they did know earlier on, that's the chiddush, we still need to check again. Now, the only problem with all of this is that in the Pirush HaMishnayos that the Rambam wrote, he also explains this Mishnah, and he's explaining it exactly the way that we have it in the Gemara in front of us. Not the way he says in his Halacha Sefer. The Rambam says the explanation of the Mishnah is, explaining the Gemara in that same way, that if the child did not know earlier on in the year, that's when we will check again. So we can't say that the reason the Rambam paskins that if they do know earlier in the year, we're going to check them again, is because he had a different girsa, because clearly he had this girsa in the Gemara the same way we have it, that only if we didn't check them early, only if they didn't have the understanding earlier on in the year, that's when we're going to check again. Now the Rebbe turns to an interesting point. In later years, in more recent years, there was a second edition of the Pirush HaMishnayos printed, where the Rambam, in fact, quotes the Gemara the same way as he paskins in his Yad HaChazak, in his Halacha Sefer, that if the child did know earlier in the year, that's when we're going to check again. In other words, the Rambam clearly had both versions of the Gemara. And for some reason, he specifically chose the version of the Gemara that's not the common version of the Gemara, and that's also the way he paskins in his Sefer Hayad, that even if the child knew and understood the value and the significance of the neder earlier in the year, we're still going to check again later in the year. So we need to understand, why is the Rambam choosing this uncommon version, especially that it seems to be a very big chiddush, a very great chiddush, to say that even someone that we know already had the facts, he understood all about a neder earlier in the year, what, is that going to change later? The Rebbe says there's another difference between these two additions in the Rambam's Pirush HaMishnayos, and that is regarding what's called Oinas Nedorim. Oinas Nedorim means the stage, the time when a child could fully make a neder, which is what's called Muflo Samuch L'Ish. The Gemara refers to it at the time that he can make a neder close to adulthood, although they're not fully adults yet. And the Rebbe is going to say that the differences between the two versions in the Rambam, the two editions in the Rambam, between this age of Muflo Samuch L'Ish, is going to be dependent and connected to the other two differences that we found in the Pirush HaMishnayos, of what is the main focus, of when do we need to check again whether the child originally knew, and then we're going to check again later, or if the child didn't know, and that's when we're going to check again. So in the first edition of the Pirush HaMishnayos, the Rambam says that Oinas Nedorim, the time for Nedorim, is the year before Bar and Bas Mitzvah, when a girl is 11 and the boy is 12. If we checked and we know that they know the significance of the vow, etc. However, in the later edition of the Pirush HaMishnayos, and the way he paskins in his book of Halacha, the Rambam says, no, Oinas Nedorim is actually the time of Bar Bas Mitzvah. When the boy is 13, the girl is 12. And Oinas Nedorim, the significance of that is that even if they don't understand yet what a neder is all about, and even if they didn't reach the stage of maturity physically, the physical signs of maturity, pubic hairs, etc., nevertheless, as far as nedarim, they are considered 100% valid nedarim from the stage of bar and bas mitzvah. So that's called oinos nedarim. Now, there is still this other aspect that even the year before that, if they have the knowledge, their neder will be also counted as a neder, but it's not the full oinos nedarim stage of nedarim yet. So the Rebbe wants to understand why the difference between these two understandings of when Oinas Nedorim starts, and how is this connected to the question we were speaking about earlier of when we need to check again with the child. Is it in a case where they didn't know earlier and we're checking to see whether by now they do understand the significance? Or is it, even if they did know earlier, we're going to check again as well? In order to explain all of this, says the Rebbe, we're first going to have a look at another idea when we say that a child before bar or bas mitzvah could make a neder. What exactly is it that we're saying causes that they could make this neder? Is it about the age? In other words, we're saying the Torah revealed to us that a year before bar or bas mitzvah, this is already a time when they could start making nedarim. And the fact that we're going to check about their knowledge and understanding, that's sort of more like just a technical thing, because if they don't understand it, then it's just not going to be good enough. But it's really mainly about the age. Or no, is the main point about the understanding, the das. And what we're saying is that for nedarim, for vows, they just don't need the same level of understanding as what's needed for most mitzvahs, which is bar or bas mitzvah. But even a bit of a lower level of das of understanding is needed, is enough. And that's the main thing. So is it about the age primarily, or is it about das? Says the Rebbe, these two ways of looking at it, the possibility for both ways of looking at it, would only make sense if we said that the oinas nedarim, the time when nedarim are fully taking place, is the year before bar and bas mitzvah, as the first version in the Pirush HaMishnayos. And that would also fit with our Gemara, the way the Gemara is in front of us. In other words, what is the Gemara saying according to this way of understanding? Originally, the Gemara thinks that mufla samuch le'ish, this idea that even before full adulthood you can make a neder, is because of the age. The boy is already 12 years old and the girl is 11 years old. And this is why the Gemara suggests, originally understanding the Mishnah, that once they were asked and once they were checked and they didn't know the significance of the vow, we would have thought there's no point of asking again. Why? Because if the whole point is about a certain age, that at this age, they're definitely already within the realm of a certain level of understanding vows, etc., but it's mainly about the age. So when we come to this child now, this 12-year-old boy or 11-year-old girl, and we see practically they don't understand the significance of a vow. So then what's the point checking again later in the year? We see the age is not what did it for this child. That's what the Gemara says. We would have thought if the Mishnah did not tell us that we need to check the whole year. So that's what the Gemara says. So it's not about the age. It's really about the das, the knowledge, the understanding. And therefore, even though, yes, earlier on in the year they didn't have the understanding, you know what? But later on in the year they might have the understanding, so let's check again. So that's all, again, the Shita of the Rambam in the first version of the Pirush HaMishnayos, and that's the way he understands the Gemara. But then comes the Rambam in the Sefer Hayad, in the book of Halacha, and in the second edition of the Pirush HaMishnayos, where we say here the Rambam is going with the general idea that Oynas Nedarim, the real proper time of Nedarim, is at age of Bar Mitzvah or Bas Mitzvah. And the reason why we're calling it Mufla Samuch Leish, that it's even before adulthood, because it's even if he doesn't have the signs of maturity yet, he doesn't even have the understanding of Nedarim, nevertheless a Neder is a full Neder no matter what. Whereas the year before that, when the boy is 12 or the girl is 11, this is sort of a little bit of a different category. It's not what's called Oynas Nedarim. So what's causing the special idea of this year before Bar and Bas Mitzvah, according to this way of looking at it? If Oynas Nedarim didn't start at 11 or 12, well, then it's surely not the age, because that's the whole point of the age of Bar and Bas Mitzvah, that no matter what, the neder, the vow is going to be a proper vow, whether they understand, or they don't understand, whether they have the signs of maturity or don't have the signs of maturity. The age of Bar and Bas Mitzvah came, that's it. So what is it about the year before Bar and Bas Mitzvah? So then we must say the only way of understanding it is about that there's a certain level of das that starts then. That if he has the knowledge and the understanding of what a neder is all about, then he can make the neder, the vow. Now, if according to this, right from the outset, das, the knowledge, the understanding is the most important thing, then how could the Gemara even suggest to think that if there wasn't knowledge in the beginning of the year, there's no point of checking again? Obviously, by nature, a child grows and matures. If there's no knowledge and understanding and maturity early in the year, he might get to it a little bit later. And therefore, the Rambam learns that the point of the Gemara was exactly the opposite. Originally, the Gemara thinks that if there is knowledge and understanding and maturity in the beginning of the year, there's no point of checking again later. And that's why the Gemara now needs to come and say to Chiddush, no, you know what? You still need to check again later. Why is that? By the Rambam, this is a very simple, logical thing. It doesn't even need sort of like a proof for this. That the concept of saying a chazaka, that just because a child had a proper knowledge before, then we can rely on that knowledge now as well for a child that doesn't apply. This whole concept of das, of a strong mindset, of a strong attitude, of a strong and firm decision in the mind doesn't apply by a little child. Why is it that only a bar mitzvah boy or girl, that's when they become responsible for their actions? Because that's when we say their mind is not being swayed. They have a firm das, they have firm knowledge, firm understanding. So by a child, just because he understood something and understood the significance earlier in the year, that's no proof for later in the year. That's why we need to check again, even if he did know. So based on what we're saying is that it really all hinges on the idea of how we understand Oynas Nedarim, when the full significance of Nedarim start. And because the Rambam says that the full Nedarim start only at Bar and Bas Mitzvah, that's why he's also going to learn that the year before Bar and Bas Mitzvah, you really need to keep on checking again, even if he did have the understanding before. So why is it that the Rambam is of the opinion that the main idea of this Oynas Nedarim, of the period in Nedarim, mainly starts by Bar Mitzvah, not before that, although technically, yes, if they have the understanding, they will be able to make a vow earlier on as well. Says the Rebbe, because the truth is there's a tremendous novelty in the idea of vows that we don't have anything similar to it anywhere else. We're taking something that was permissible according to Torah. The person says he's making it usher, he's making it forbidden on himself, and the way a neder usually works, he says this is going to be like a carbon to me. In other words, he's taking the kedusha, similar to that of a carbon, and he's bringing it to this ordinary, regular object. And in a certain sense, even more than by karbanis, this is a chiddush. By karbanos, there's certain limitations, which things you can bring for a carbon. Here, there's almost like no limitations. You take any item and you say, this is like a carbon, and you brought the kedusha to it. So the Rebbe says there's an interesting paradox over here. On the one hand, you need this amazing, tremendous koyach to be able to bring down such a kedusha to ordinary things. And at the same time, the Torah is saying that even a minor who's not shaykh to other mitzvahs yet, he's able to do this. And therefore, the Rambam is sort of limiting this power and saying, fine, it's enough to be able to apply this to a bar bas mitzvah child that maybe didn't reach physical maturity yet, but we can't also apply to even a younger child, only a 12-year-old boy or 11-year-old girl. But the Rebbe says, bottom line is, many opinions do hold that this concept of mufla samach lish does apply in the year before bar bas mitzvah as well. And this can be understood, says the Rebbe, based on what the Tzemach Tzedek explains regarding the idea of nedarim, of vows. And he explains why it doesn't have actually these limitations like by karbonos. Tzemach Tzedek says by karbonos, the kedusha is coming down because of Torah says that this thing is a carbon or could be a carbon. In other words, this is Hashem's chachma. By a neder, this kedusha is coming from a level that's higher than chachma. And that's in fact the word the Torah uses regarding nedarim, lahafli. Mufla, lahafli is the word we're using a lot. It's in the word pella, like a wonder. In other words, a level that's higher than chachma. And this is happening because a yid in essence is even really higher even than the level of Torah. The bond of a yid with Hashem goes even deeper than Torah. And therefore, this could happen even before the age where a yid is chayiv in the rest of the mitzvahs. This idea of a neder could already apply, because at this point, this level of pella, this level that's higher than chachma, this higher level of kedusha he's having access to, is already coming even before bar mitzvah in a revealed way.